Of all of Abraham Maslow's ideas, many of which circulate around the themes of motivation and personality, his most famous is undoubtedly his hierarchy of needs, which appears in pretty much every introductory psychology textbook's description of humanistic psychology. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is almost always presented in the form of a triangle or pyramid, is the idea that human beings are first motivated to satisfy our basic physical needs, such as needs for food, shelter, and safety, and then our psychological needs, such as needs for a sense of belonging and esteem, and then finally what he calls self-actualization needs, which have to do with fulfilling the deepest possibilities inherent in our being. Maslow further divides self-actualization needs into two subcategories: Theory Z, which has to do with self-actualization that includes the presence of what he calls peak experiences or possibly plateau experiences, and Theory Y, which does not include such experiences. Basically, a peak experience is a brief, intense, often spiritual experience of ecstasy or oneness with God or the cosmos or unity with all of life. A plateau experience is like a peak experience, but not as intense and more long-lasting, more serene or contemplative, as he puts it. One of the upshots of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that all of our motivations point ultimately toward the fulfillment of our being, irrespective of whether we're inclined to have peak experiences or not. In this regard, Maslow's psychological ideas are highly ontological in flavor, a common theme within humanistic psychology more generally. This ontological predilection is also reflected in another basic distinction that Maslow draws between our different motivations. According to Maslow, many of our motivations are fueled by deficiencies in our lives. For instance, one motivation to succeed in the work world would be because one experiences a deficiency of money or material well-being in one's life. Maslow calls this kind of motivation a deficiency motivation, or demotivation for short. On the other hand, perhaps one's drive to succeed in the work world is fueled by a desire to fulfill the deepest possibilities of one's being. Maslow calls this kind of motivation, which basically maps onto self-actualization, a being motivation, or B motivation. Maslow then extends the use of the prefixes D and B across many areas of our lives. For instance, we have D needs and B needs, that is, needs driven by deficiencies and needs driven by self-actualization. Similarly, we have D cognitions and B cognitions, D values and B values, and so on. But if all of our motivations are ultimately fueled by our movement toward fulfilling our being, then why do experiences where we're actually doing that seem so comparatively uncommon? Maslow explains this riddle in terms of what he calls the Jonah complex. Like the biblical Jonah, who famously turned away from God's commandment to prophesy the destruction of Nineveh, the capital of ancient Assyria, we too often turn away from fulfilling our deepest possibilities and destinies in life. As the poet Marianne Williamson famously put it, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. The reasons for this are several. First, when we glimpse deep and powerful possibilities within ourselves, there comes along with that a weighty sense of responsibility for what we do or do not do with them. As Maslow puts it, what a man can be, he must be. So the Jonah complex is motivated in part by our desire to escape the sense of responsibility that comes with self-actualization. Beyond this, however, we're afraid of our deeper potentials because we're afraid of the social and interpersonal consequences of deep change. For most of us, the fear of being misunderstood and rejected is deep and primitive. But the reality of self-actualization is that it may call us beyond our already existing definitions and patterns of life, and perhaps so far out of life as we've known it, that our fear is that other people might not understand or accept us. Of course, if maintaining our friendships requires that we not live toward what's deepest and best in us, well, we might well wonder whether those people are really our friends at all. As Marianne Williamson again puts it, your playing small doesn't serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. However, perhaps the deepest motivation behind the Jonah complex is that there's something irreducibly overwhelming about the experience of glimpsing the power inherent in our being. In other words, the Jonah complex is also about a fear of annihilation, a terror we feel about the possibility that life as we've known it might need to die so that some new, more powerful way of life can be born. In this regard, the Jonah complex is an expression of our fear of mortality, which in the final analysis is a fear of the reality of our own existence. In essence, we are what we fear and run from. Although Maslow's emphasis on self-actualization often prompts his critics to accuse him of formulating a kind of psychology that encourages self-preoccupation and social disconnection, it's important to note that Maslow emphasized that the self-actualizing subjects he studied were all deeply engaged in the affairs of the surrounding world. As he puts it in The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, perhaps his most famous work, self-actualizing people are, without a single exception, involved in a cause outside their own skin, in something outside of themselves. Basically, self-actualization involves a kind of selflessness. Furthermore, Maslow repeatedly notes that the self of self-actualization is not the egoistic sense of self at all, but the kind of self, or perhaps non-self, we have when we're completely immersed in the moment. Basically, the self of self-actualization is marked by the disappearance of our usual egoistic sense of self, not its aggrandizement. One area where all of this plays out is in the domain of creativity, which again is a fairly common topic within humanistic psychology. For Maslow, engaging in creative activity is one of the primary ways we have of moving towards self-actualization. It's also one of the more common places where peak experiences occur. Basically, Maslow divides creativity into two phases. First, there's the volcanic inspirational phase, which he calls primary creativeness. And then there's the relatively long, arduous phase that involves working out and refining that inspiration, a phase he calls secondary creativeness. Primary creativeness, which sometimes takes the form of a peak experience, is marked by qualities such as immersion in the moment, entering into trust and Taoistic receptivity, and finding oneself in a state of holistic integration with the world and with oneself. Consequently, Maslow stresses the importance of things like art education, where we can learn not merely more complex cognitive skills, but better ways of being alive. As he says in his discussion of education, to put it bluntly, we need a different kind of human being. And so, as is the case with most other humanistic psychologists, Maslow's thought also includes some measure of social critique. As we've seen, part of this plays out in his view of education. However, perhaps a more trenchant critique resides in his description of our era as desacralized, a kind of loss of the sense of the sacred and of the grandeur of life. For Maslow, desacralization is both a social historical tendency and a defense mechanism that has the undesirable side effect of lessening our chances to experience self-actualization. That's because our ability to see the sacred, the eternal, and the symbolic, as he puts it, actually fosters and enhances our opportunities to experience it. In this regard, Maslow draws a linkage between our capacity to see things holistically on one hand and self-actualization on the other. All in all, much of Maslow's thought circulates around the idea of acknowledging and fulfilling our human potential, and self-actualization is basically a way of characterizing it. In this regard, Maslow's work represents an attempt to expand the outer boundary of psychology so that it more easily encompasses life's positive, fulfilling experiences, in addition to the painful, pathological ones. However, for Maslow, even the idea of self-actualization doesn't provide a final destination for our lives. That's because the very act of actualizing our potential can't help but change us, which in turn naturally changes our potential too. So, in the final analysis, as with most other humanistic psychologists, Maslow's thought crystallizes in a view of life that is open-ended and that resists offering us any easy or final resting place.
In part one of this series, we will be discussing the two broad areas of honesty and awareness. By honesty, we mean honesty to be your feelings, to trust your sense of humor, to trust your anger, your love in interpersonal relations. Now to the first characteristic of honesty, sense of humor. A philosophical, unhostile sense of humor that elicits a smile, usually more than a laugh, that is intrinsic to the situation rather than added to it, that is spontaneous rather than planned, and that very often can never be repeated.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's inventive and creative and fits the situation. One thing I learned from these people originally was to slough off our cultural thing, you know, about Bob Hope and Jack Benny and so on as humorists. I don't know if they have any sense of humor or not. They just say what other people write. And we think of that as humor, wisecracks and so on. And we don't make enough of the Mark Twain kind of thing, or best of all of the Abraham Lincoln kind of thing, one could speak of Lincoln-esque humor and make the point. Now the lesson, what I learned, the lesson that I learned was, at the extremes anyhow, that the many actual instances of humor were hostile. In the extreme instance, the worst community I ever lived in, they made fun of a feeble-minded boy, and the other kids would plague him, run after him, pull at him, and so on, with their fathers and so on, the adults smiling very indulgently. That was very amusing. Their kids were having a good time. And I remember one time with throwing rocks at this feeble-minded boy. I still remember that clang on his skull, and the boy crying, and everybody then laughing. This was a climax of laughter. Well, that's the most naked example I can think of the kind of hostile, essentially hostile humor, which means making fun of somebody else or laughing at somebody slipping on a banana peel, you know. And the contrast is tremendously great, because what's involved in Lincoln-esque humor, or in the Adlai Stevenson kind of humor, is really a laughing at the human condition. It's a good-natured laughter at, the silliness of the whole business, the ludicrousness of the human situation. And, of course, there's no barb. It doesn't hurt anybody. This actually, in a certain sense, teaches somebody something. Well, this is, all the instances are creative. That is, they happen once, they happen on the spur of the moment, or response to a particular situation, which may never happen again. And we must learn to make that differentiation.
The peak experience, the mystic experience, the oceanic feeling. Feelings of limitless horizons opening up to the vision, the feeling of being simultaneously more powerful and more helpless than one ever was before, the feeling of great ecstasy and wonder and awe, the loss of placing in time and space with, and finally the conviction that something extremely important and valuable has happened.
Yeah, it's a very good thing for a person. Magic moments, in an article I read today, they were called. Well, there is some history here, which I think would be of interest. In my subjects at first, what I stumbled across, this I wasn't looking for, were what I had to call mystic experiences. There were reports of such experiences. And I had come into this investigation with the normal equipment of the normal person of the culture, thinking that mystical experiences happen to one saint, you know, every century or something like that. And here I kept, people would talk to me in the same words as Saint Teresa or Meister Eckhart or some of these other people that I'd read, the famous mystics. Well, I've put it down that way. And but then kept on discovering more and more that these came from many triggers. They came from all kinds of sources, from the love experience or the being on top of a mountain, or just being taken over by music, or somebody going along a seashore and then just going into this state. And I had to generalize it. And furthermore, I had to strip it of its traditionally, historically religious, specifically religious meaning, because it turned out not to be. The peak experiences came from many, many things, many triggers. Once I tried to generalize them as anything that moves, anything that comes close to perfection. An experience of perfection will produce a peak experience. Whether in athletics, in one of my subjects, a young man breaking through with the ball into an open field and then running down the field and reporting in the same words that ancient mystics had used. This was a 17-year-old boy. Or totally stumbling across this by the purest accident of the women in natural childbirth reporting ecstasies of mystic experiences or peak experiences. So what I want to do is to generalize that. I found since that peak experiences do not occur, they're not the exclusive prerogative of one pantheon of people, but they occur very widely through the population. It looks now, and a preliminary statement would be that the higher the degree of psychological health, the greater the frequency of peak experiences, the higher they reach, the more intense they are, and the more illuminated, that is, the more cognitive they are, the more you learn from them. If you see the world in the peak experience in a more pure form, this can be remembered. Some people do remember, some people don't remember. The people who do remember tend to be changed, just as the ancient mystics reported.